All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and get started with the second session of the eBEEF Brown Bagger, and we welcome you here to our second session. My name is Bob Weber, and I'll be serving as host for today. And I'm on faculty here at Kansas State University, and pleased to partner with colleagues Dare Bullock and Matt Spangler in bringing this Brown Bagger series to you. If you happen to miss last week, you'll note that we are under a little bit different branding this year. We've moved this webinar under the eBEEF.org umbrella. And so as you move forward and look for resources related to the brown bagger and other things beef genetics related from an extension perspective, eBEEF.org is a great spot to go and find a variety of those resources, including previous brown bagger webinars that were under the NBC-EC auspices are listed there, as well as our updated beef sire selection manual. So again, eBEEF.org, and welcome to session two. We've got two outstanding speakers today. The first one is Dr. David Lalman. Dr. Lalman's a professor and extension beef cattle specialist at Oklahoma State University and works out of the Stillwater offices. Dr. Lalman holds the Howard M. and Adine R. Harrington Endowed Chair and has a split research and extension appointment there in animal science. He serves as the Animal Science Extension Program Coordinator and Supervisor of the Range Cow Research Center North Range Unit, which is just west of Stillwater a bit. He works primarily in the beef cattle industry, focused on cow-calf and stocker cattle production. And his extension and applied research program includes beef cattle nutrition and management, with emphasis on beef cattle grazing and genetic by environment interactions in beef production systems. And so although Dave is technically an animal nutritionist, he's one that is frequently included in our animal breeding discussions because of that interest in G by E. And I think Dr. Lalman's one of the outstanding extension and research faculty working with a real focus on cow-calf production and the adaptation and efficiency of cows in their production environment. So David, we're delighted to have you with us today and look forward to your comments on a topic that you've given probably hundreds of talks on this topic, but I'm always amazed every time I hear it. It's got a new piece and a new twist. Mm-hmm. And so look forward to your comments today around the effects of milk and mature size on feed intake and cow costs. And know you're doing some great work there at the North Range Unit. Had the privilege of a year or so ago getting a tour of that facility and the great infrastructure you're putting together there, focused on cow efficiency. So I'm going to turn Dave my mic and camera off. Just keep the recording clean here. If you do need me, just call out and I'll dive back in here and help as needed. But you'll see me go away for just a sec, and then I'll pass control to you. Okay?
Sounds good. Thank you, Bob. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Excuse me, Dr. Weber. And so what I've tried to do is distill this down to these two topics. Going to try to focus on effects of milk and mature size, on feed intake probably mostly, but hope to leave you with some practical ideas of the influence of those two factors on feed intake. And then I think it was pretty simple for the most part, pretty simple to take those values I'm going to leave you with and calculate your own cost based on, the cost of the resources in your region for beef cow production. At least that contacted me about participating in your seminar. And by the way, thank you also to the committee, the group, for considering, my contributions here today. Dr. Weber, trying to forward. There we go. Maybe it just took a second to catch on. All right, so I'll real quick acknowledge some of my colleagues here. My graduate student group, Dr. Mariana Garcia is a postdoc in our lab group, and then Emma Briggs just graduated and joined the faculty there at Kansas State, and Sam Talley and Bailey Thompson both working on master's degrees. Okay, so let's just start off with kind of the principles of energy partitioning in a cow. Nutrient costs go beyond energy, but energy pretty much drives the wagon or the train, and most protein requirements in particular are very highly related from an amount per day standpoint. Protein would be somewhat similar. It's not a perfect correlation, but somewhat similar. So I'm going to use just as this example, a 1,200 pound beef cow. That's probably a little bit below industry average, near as I can tell, but that's about what our cows weigh out at the research unit I'm responsible for. 24 pounds of peak milk yield would be fairly common in our cow herd. And just to put that in perspective now, that's 24 pounds of peak milk yield, which occurs rapidly after calving in a beef cow, and then starts to go down, and there's a gradual decline in that daily milk yield until those calves are weaned. And so to kind of give you some perspective on that, an average milk production throughout the entire lactation for a cow with 24 pounds of milk at peak is going to be just a little bit under 18 pounds a day average. Okay. And so that'll maybe become a little bit more important as we go along here. The energy pools that the cow must partition energy to include maintenance, lactation. Obviously it requires energy as well as protein and minerals to produce milk. And then the same goes for pregnancy, the fetus, as well as the maternal tissue required to maintain a pregnancy requires energy, protein, and minerals. And then mostly heat and cold stress mostly relate to energy requirements, but we'll put those at the bottom of our list here. There's not much known about heat and cold stress, and it's really hard to quantify those numbers, especially given all the dramatic differences in environments that we have across the country. And then the one other that I didn't list and normally gets lumped into the maintenance category is the requirement for travel or movement in the cattle. And obviously that's going to be more substantial in an area where the cattle have to walk a long ways throughout the day to acquire their forage, compared to someone that has a relatively high stocking rate and maybe introduce forage in a 40 plus annual inch rainfall area where those cows just don't have to cover very much ground. But in general, that requirement is lumped into maintenance. It's another one that we don't really know very much about and need more data to sort of clarify where that fits in. Maintenance is, as you're going to see, is a big deal here, and so I wanted to define that for you. And according to, I'm going to refer here several times to this National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, NASEM, publication. The latest revision was produced in 2016. About anywhere from, I don't know, it seems like 8 to 12 or 14 years, the government rounds up a beef cattle committee to update this publication. And they generally rely on some of the, most notable, sometimes legendary people in the animal sciences field to participate on this committee. And so it's very, very good information. And this publication is considered the Bible of beef cattle nutrition, if you will. I can tell you all of my graduate students get one as soon as they land on Oklahoma State campus. So maintenance is the energy needed to achieve no net loss or gain of energy retained in the tissue of the animal's body. and that is considered beyond the requirements for milk production, beyond the requirements for that pregnancy that we talked about, beyond the requirements for heat and cold stress. So now let's just take a quick look then and see, kind of what the relative values is for those. And this is for that 1,200 pound cow that's given about 24 pounds of milk at peak. So here's the megacalories. In the second column, you see the megacalories estimated for an annual production cycle. And when you're talking megacalories, you need to know which megacalories the speaker or the resource is referring to. And here we're going to talk about net energy for maintenance, which is kind of the all-around number that we use in cow-calf nutrition. Either that, or from an energy standpoint, we might consider total digestible nutrients another kind of a fundamental terminology that we utilize. But in terms of calories, we're going to talk about net energy for maintenance values here, not metabolizable energy, not digestible energy, not net energy for gain, but net energy for maintenance. So be sure and keep that in mind. You see that maintenance is by far and away the biggest portion of this cow's requirement throughout the year, and that in this case that calculates to 67%. Her lactation requirement, if she has kind of industry average milk composition, meaning fat, protein, lactose, and so forth, it's going to require about 23% of that 5,117 megacalories throughout the year. 7% for pregnancy and 3% for heat and cold stress. And just realize that all of those are going to be quite variable depending on the genetics, the genetic capacity of the animal that we're talking about, and the body size. So my job today is to talk about the influence of cow size and the influence of milk production. So cow size has the biggest impact, or the biggest factor impacting maintenance is cow size. All right. And so it's not the only factor that influences maintenance, but it's by far and away the biggest factor. Obviously, lactation is pretty much isolated to those requirements to produce milk. And by the way, when a cow begins to produce milk right after she calves, it looks like from the literature published that her maintenance requirement goes up by about 20%. And so all of the visceral organ mass has to work harder during lactation. And so that's why her maintenance goes up along with that 23% or 1,194 megacalories that actually goes directly to the milk. Pregnancy, that's fairly independent of or in other words, not influenced by cow size or milk production, fairly independent cow size. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, Bob, Matt, and others, we might not have considered that to be the case. But now it seems like we have such good control of birth weight, calving ease, and so on, and still produce cattle with high mature weight, big carcass weights, and so on, without those big birth weights. And so I'd say at this point in time, we can kind of consider their nutrient requirements for pregnancy to be independent of those factors. So let's just move on then and talk a little bit about each one of these. And we're going to start off then with cow weight considerations on the cow's feed intake and cost. So if you just back up a minute, and this is one of my favorite slides. These guys have seen it a lot, but champions from 1835 and 1937. And, cow size is, as I recall, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.35 maybe in heritability, at least in the Angus data set. And so it's a trait that we can make rather rapid progress or change in if we choose to put aggressive genetic selection in one direction or the other. And our industry has done that. Absolutely, we have. And some of you will remember the belt buckle cattle we had. I remember in high school the hat band cattle we had that were really tall. And now we're kind of back to moderate sized cows. But right now in the industry and in the NASEM publication for nutrient requirements, in a lot of the nutritional software, cow size is used as a proxy for feed intake. That's one of the primary uses of it. And it is a good place to start, a good place to estimate about what a cow should consume, because it is true, we see it in our own data, that on average, the bigger the cow is, the more feed she's going to consume. Cow size also has implications in terms of cull cow market value and therefore income. You would expect, since there's a strong genetic correlation between mature cow size, carcass weight, and yearling weight, that the mature cow size is going to influence weaning weight, post-weaning growth, and carcass weight as well. So those are all things that, cow size, things that we need to consider when we're talking about cost and generating revenue. So let's just kind of look real quick and see what's going on in the industry. These are just simply genetic trends that I've downloaded from the different breed associations. Here I'm showing you the genetic trend over time for mature cow weight and yearling weight in the Hereford breed. And you can see, of course, that those are increasing. And you can also kind of see, that strong genetic correlation there as you view those. This is the same genetic correlation for yearling weight and mature cow weight in the Angus breed. And, they just go hand in hand, and the industry continues to select aggressively for yearling weight. I don't think the industry is intentionally selecting for increased mature cow weight, but that is what appears to be happening as time goes by. Okay, here's some of those genetic correlations I talked about and why you would anticipate selection for more aggressive selection for growth to increase cow size over time, as well as have a pretty substantial influence on feed intake, unless, of course, you implemented some systematic program or breeding program with a high priority objective to control feed intake or to control mature cow size. And so, here's kind of the proof in the pudding, and that is, those are working over time. In other words, we are getting cattle that have heavier carcass weights, mature cow size. Granted, these changes, these are USDA inspected plant carcass weights over time. Blue is steers, the red there is the heifers, the kind of gold or yellow, orange, whatever color that is at the bottom is cow carcass weight. You have to recognize, at least in terms of the steers and heifers, this is not all genetic influence. There is considerable amount of improved technology that has been adapted, mostly through the cattle feeding phase of the industry, and also influences those changes, obviously, in carcass weight. But if you just look at that, since 1978, the trend in carcass weights in cows, and then you take a yield coefficient and you convert the cow carcass weights to mature cow weights, I calculate that this indicates that cow size has increased since 1978 at about the rate of a little over 7 pounds per year. And so in 10 years, if, we don't change this trend over time, our cows should weigh about 73 pounds heavier on average than they do today. So what does that mean in terms of maybe stocking rate implications? If we just use cow size to estimate an annual forage requirement for cows, and that's what I'm showing you here. This is another one of those slides that I shared out there at the BIF meeting. And I just used a 10,000 acre ranch in north central Oklahoma, fairly industry average forage production, industry average harvest efficiency on that ranch. And we calculated that, if this 10,000 acre ranch fit those characteristics, I guess, you could run about 1,115,000 pound cows or 805 1,500 pound cows and put the same grazing pressure on that land base with those numbers. So that's just kind of give you some perspective. And then another thing, I think it's kind of interesting to look at it over time like this. If we consider that someone who'd had a 30-year career in cattle industry, somebody like maybe Dr. Weber's made so much money with his cows, he's ready to retire after 30 years, and he can look back when he started doing this when he was 25. The difference there would be just over 200-pound change in mature cow weight at the rate of a little over 7 pounds per year. And so on this ranch, that would indicate that they should be running about 130 fewer cows today than he did 30 years ago when he started his career. And again, with the objective of applying about the same grazing pressure on that land base. So that just kind of gives you some perspective on how change in cow size might influence income on a ranch or stocking capacity, those kind of things. Okay, so then let's shift in and talk just a little bit about how does cow size affect feed intake. And this one is maybe a little bit more straightforward, but honestly, we don't have as much data like we all of us academic types say, as we would like. So this is a coefficient I'm showing you here in this table that the NASEM committee published first in 1996. And basically, if you go through the math and you calculate their equation based on what I consider to be about average annual forage quality that a cow would consume, and just to put that in perspective, we're going to use the number of about 60% TDN on average year round. They should be able to consume about 1.47 pounds more forage for each additional 100 pounds of cow body weight. Okay, so now you could plug that in and do your own calculations to see what it would cost you to run that extra set of 100 cows. That extra 100 pounds of mature cow body weight. We've been doing some work on this. We've discovered some other data here more recently, and I'm going to share those with you here right quick. And what we have found is that a range of 1.4 to about 2.3 in Amanda Holder's data. Megan Gross did a real nice literature review, and we just published a paper with a new equation. And her new equation indicates, and that was from much more recent data than the NASEM literature review included. That would be a relationship of about 1.93 pounds of forage for each additional 100 pounds of mature cow body weight. And then Sam Talley's got a data set just here from this last year in both gestation and lactation. His coefficient was about 2.3 additional pounds of forage for each 100 pounds of additional cow weight. So we think the number is higher. Why is it higher than the old NASEM equation that a lot of the nutrition software programs are using today? Well, that data was collected, or the research was conducted from 1960 to about 1985 or so. And so these others are, of course, with more modern cattle and a lot of other techniques that I won't get into. We think that maybe is why the NASEM equation pretty substantially underestimates feed intake and the relationship to cow size. Okay, so last thing on this topic I want to hit on right quick is the idea of whether feed intake EPDs work for cows. We don't have a nice big data set with 1,000+ animals to calculate a genetic correlation for this. Really wish we did have one to see if we can use those dry matter intake EPDs already available, published by the breed associations, and make progress with it in our cow herd, or use it to help control genetic capacity for feed intake or appetite in the cow herd. So we looked through the literature and tried to find what phenotypic correlations we could find. These first 3 studies are those that we found already published in the literature. Notice they're all positive and moderate in terms of correlation. These are some of the more recent studies we've done there at OSU. These 2 trials were done with cows. In both cases, these are crossover studies where we started out half the cows on forage and then later on shifted them to a concentrate or a mixed diet. And then the other half of the cows had just the opposite treatment. So we're trying to take out the compensatory gain effect there. And basically, we got exactly the same answer. And then Emma's data with heifers over the last few years, you see here at the bottom of the table. But in all 7 of these studies, I just want you to notice that the correlation, we'd rather it be closer to 1, but at least it's moderate and positive and consistent. And so that gives me encouragement that we could be able to use those dry matter intake EPDs to control feed intake in the cow herd. And so you ask, well, how might you use this, or what can we do now maybe to implement this and do a better job of controlling mature cow size? Well, here I've just downloaded 600 bulls from the Angus Association's website. And what I'm showing you in the green dashed lines is Angus breed average for feed intake EPD and mature cow weight EPD in the vertical green dashed line there. And I've circled some bulls. There weren't very many bulls in the top left quadrant of my graph here. But, I don't know why you would want to do this. If you're selecting for smaller cows, you certainly wouldn't want to select for the purpose of controlling cow costs. You definitely wouldn't want to select smaller cows with genetic capacity for higher than breed average feed intake. And so, I think that could be powerful, at least weeding out some sires that might have that combination of genetic capacity. And then here's maybe an idea for somebody who had a breeding objective that was real strong or high priority to control cow cost or feed intake. I mean, it seems to me like this would be a really good way to ensure that you would be controlling costs, and that is by selecting cattle that have below breed average mature weight EPD and below breed average feed intake EPD. Don't get me wrong, you need to draw the square or the circle where it fits your breeding objectives and what you're trying to accomplish. But there's just some ideas for you. It's interesting to me. Here's a few bulls here on this graph that are actually above breed average cow size or mature cow weight and below breed average on feed intake. And so you might get the best of both worlds. Granted, the cattle sires that you select would have to create daughters that could check all of the other boxes. And so certainly not suggesting that we would overlook any of those traits. So there's kind of my take home real quick on mature cow size. And I'll just let you look at those, and I'm sure these will be available for you later on. But let me get on to the topic of milk production and its influence on feed intake in the cow herd. Here's a genetic trend, kind of show you what's going on in Angus, Red Angus, Hereford. I didn't download Simmental, but theirs has been relatively stable for quite a few years. But the Angus, Red Angus, Hereford trends are all, I'd say, gradually increasing with a little bit different shapes to the genetic trend curves, as you can see there. But not, it appears that there is no longer, anyway, real aggressive selection for milk in the cattle industry. So let me bring this up. I think Dare wanted me to, Dr. Bullock wanted me to talk about this real quickly. And that is, in that NASEM publication in 1996, and again in 2016 made a statement like this. I think this one comes directly from the 2016 publication, that they suggest that there's a positive relationship between that huge maintenance requirement that I shared with you earlier and genetic potential for measures of productivity. So bigger cows with more genetic potential for growth, cows that give more milk, so on and so forth, would have higher maintenance requirements. Dr. Harvey Freetley and others in the industry had been maybe kind of, skeptical about this statement over time. I noticed that, and I was kind of curious about it. And finally, we conducted our own study. Emma published this in 2022, very intensive study. I won't go into the details, but in this study, what we discovered was that, and this represents energy output down here, retained energy, basically in the form of milk production and cow weight gain. And here's the cow's maintenance requirement here. So as the cow produced more milk and gained more weight, she had lower maintenance. Exactly the opposite of the statement published in the NASEM requirement. So all of a sudden, I guess when you do your own, sometimes it takes your own work or effort to convince yourself of something. But, I'd say maybe this one is still up in the air, but I'd say that, that's a pretty clear relationship. And so I question the idea now, which I ran around the country a lot telling people that, more productivity was going to increase our maintenance requirements. Okay, so maybe the last tip here on calculating cost relative to milk beyond the maintenance issue. That book says that if you're going to assume a cow produces one more pound of milk, we're going to estimate that feed intake is going to go up by about 0.2 of a pound. All right, so that's the coefficient they use in that feed intake equation I talked about. That came from dairy cattle data quite a few years ago. It had not been validated in beef cows. We have been working, we and others have been working to see if that held up in beef cows, and we tested it directly. And so far, it looks like the number should be about double of 0.2. So we find that for each additional pound of milk in our herd primarily, you should expect forage intake to go up around 0.4, maybe a little bit more than that. So if you're trying to calculate the cost of milk production, you certainly ought to keep that in mind. I should probably say, and then I'll let Matt get to his information, but the milk EPD, maybe it's misnamed because it really is a maternal influence EPD, and only part of that change in weaning weight is due to milk yield. The challenge we have right now is we still don't have a real clear view of how much of that EPD or the change in weaning weight is due to actual milk yield versus how much of that is due to other things that the cow brings to the table. And there are a lot of other things that she might contribute to improve calf weaning weight. So I'm gonna let you read the take-home message there on the milk side of it, and see if there's any questions, Bob, and let us get on to Matt's presentation.
Great, thanks, David. That was outstanding. And as we get Matt spooled up here, maybe Matt, if it's all right, we'll take a question or two. If anybody's got a burning one. Also, Dave, if you're available to hang on to the end, we'll have some Q&A at the end too.
Sure.
So. And yeah, I failed to remind everybody, use the Q&A box if you would. That'll help us manage those. Here's one from Brian. Do you have any guess of lactation requirements being different in fall versus spring calving cows? Yeah, good, insightful question.
Well, these beef cows are very sensitive to their immediate nutrient supply. And just ask a dairyman how that goes. And so a fall calving cow has, let's say she has moderate nutrient availability mostly throughout lactation. And so if she's losing body condition gradually through the winter, like most commercial fall calving cow operations you will find, she probably has restricted milk production. And spring calving cow that has pretty nice lush forage during peak lactation, yeah, that's going to close to maximize her spring forage her lactation potential. We milked our spring calving cows here about 3 years ago. Actually, we did it 3 years in a row, and we were coming up with peak yields of around 35 pounds in Angus cows that had not been selected particularly for milk yield. So absolutely, it would have an influence on milk production.
Yeah. Joe Pascal asks, do you see any differences in Bos Indicus breeds?
In terms of milk production, I wonder, or influence of body weight. I mean, either way, it doesn't matter. I would say I do not know the answer to that question. Whether the Bos Indicus breeds would respond differently than these Bos Taurus breeds. It's a good question, but you guys might be able to answer that better than I can. You guys,
good.
meaning Dr. Spangler and Weber.
Real quick, Dave, Mark Hilton asks, can you explain more on the reduction in maintenance requirement for high milky BD cows? Now, you and I have had this conversation a little bit, kind of what that might be. And I know there's more research to be done, but what do you think physiologically or metabolically might be driving that?
Yeah, so there's two ways to look at it. I think the NASM committee had, you look at a Holstein cow and her maintenance requirements are higher than a beef cow. Obviously, she's producing a lot more milk. And so, at some point, you probably would begin to influence maintenance requirements in a negative fashion. In other words, make them go up. But in our study, it was pretty clear. Cows that had lower maintenance had more energy left over to do the work of producing more milk and allowing the cow to gain more weight. That's how it worked. It wasn't the other way around, that more milk and weight gain was driving up their maintenance. Nope, it was that maintenance was lower, therefore they had more energy available to produce.
Yeah, interesting. We've got a couple of more, but in interest of time, I'm gonna let's hold those, Dave, until the end, and we'll come back. So Jason and Philip, good questions here. We'll come back around and capture those at the end. So we'll leave them in the queue here. Stand by, and we'll make sure we get those answered for you as well. Okay. Let's go ahead and transition. David, thanks so much for your time putting this together. I know lots of work, not just in the last few days, but over your career to help kind of disentangle some of these complex questions related to cows and the production environment. And certainly appreciate your thought leadership there over time in our business. It's been really valuable to us. Thank you. Yeah, so if you'll stand by, we'll get more questions to you at the end, Dave. Let's jump over to our next speaker here in part two. Familiar face to many of you, a friend and colleague, Dr. Matt Spangler from the University of Nebraska. And several times I took note in Dr. Lalman's talk about the importance of breeding objective. And Matt's going to elaborate some on that topic and help us to make sure that our selection decisions really do match our breeding objective, and some tips and tools that we might use to explore that. As many of you know, Dr. Spangler's spent most of his academic professional career at the University of Nebraska, works extensively in genetic evaluation, genetic prediction, and genomics work, and familiar face to many of you through BIF and other engagements that he has professionally. Kansas native undergrad here at K-State as well. So Matt, floor is yours. I'm going to mute and pass control to you in the standard fashion. If you have trouble, call out, and I'll be right here.
All right, thanks, Bob. And I know, like I'm sure many of you did, I enjoyed the previous speaker considerably, and I think always a fresh look on a topic that has generated a lot of interest over the years. So I've got a topic that, in full disclosure, Dare Bullock kind of posed the question several months ago, and I thought, well, I ought to be able to tackle this, and it helped frame my thinking about I think an important important topic, and I'm going to try to at least shed some light on the way I've come to think of the issue, and start with this very simplified breeding program here. Simply, genetics flows down the breeding pyramid and economic signal flows up. The issue we have, particularly in the beef industry, is that there's substantial lag in both directions. And if we think about the segmented nature of the beef industry, particularly in context of some people selling at weaning, some people retaining ownership through harvest, it creates the capture of this, creates additional issues with the capture of this economic signal. And so that's really the framework with which I want to build the remainder of this talk. I could spend probably well over an hour just talking about where I think we need to make improvements in terms of the way both genetic dissemination and movement of economic signal up to nucleus herds works. But I'm going to go one problem at a time. So obviously, carcass endpoint indexes put selection emphasis on a different suite of traits than an index that assumes people sell at weaning would. And not only are there additional traits in a slaughter index, but really a big issue is that the marginal economic value or the weighting associated with the trait of weaning weight differs substantially between those two, and I'll show an example of that. Direct payments to cow-calf producers based on, I'll argue, assumed post-weaning performance simply don't occur at scale in the U.S. beef industry. And somebody on here, I'm sure, is going to say, well, I've got an example to the contrary. Yeah, there are examples to the contrary, but at scale, I'd argue this doesn't happen. The value differentiation of feeder calves, I'd say, is not directly tied to genetics in any kind of objective fashion. And I am not an economist, but I'd argue this is a case of market failure where people that sell at weaning are encouraged to do something for the greater good when it may not be the thing that's in their best interest. So again, not an economist, but at least that's how I'm going to define market failure today. So the pervasive thought is, well, even if you sell at weaning, all cattle get fed out, right? Everything ends up a carcass. And if I want buyers to pay more for my feeder cattle, I need to select for post-weaning performance. I certainly agree with the first point, and I understand the concerns with the second point. But what it boils down to, if we're using economic indexes, who is that index supposed to be economically optimized for? The bull buyer or the ultimate buyer of the calves? And obviously, if you sell at weaning, those are two different people. So the question, which I just phrased, is what enterprise should economic selection indexes be economically optimal for? And maybe more to the point, do selection decisions differ if the breeding goal is designed for a producer who sells at weaning versus one who retains ownership? And then what are the options in terms of a comprehensive selection scheme for somebody that does actually sell at weaning, which captures a very large number of our commercial cow-calf producers? So I've listed here 5 options, and I'm going to focus on the 3 that are in red. All right, so somebody actually uses economic index focused on a weaning endpoint, maybe uses such an index, but imposes ICL, independent culling levels, for carcass traits. In my example, those would move with genetic trend for the breed. Or they use what's more commonly available, and that's an index that assumes that retained ownership fits the producer's breeding objective. The last 2 I'm not going to focus on because the very last one, retained ownership of calves, deals with risk, availability of capital, scale of enterprise, all kinds of things I'm not qualified to professionally opine on. And then if you actually had direct payments to the cow-calf producer based on some kind of prediction of how calves would perform post-weaning, and again, we're really not in that situation at scale. So for the results I'm going to show you, I used iGendex software, something that's been spoken about at BIF and in this series before. This is just a snapshot of the web interface. Software now is made widely available through the Beef Improvement Federation. So I'm going to kick off by going over some previous work. Hunter Valasek, who was a master's student with me, published some things that kind of kick off the results section of this. What Hunter did was compared results from a weaning weight breeding objective versus a carcass breeding objective. This just shows the traits that would be in those two corresponding indexes. The work he did summarized these results over a multitude of what I'd call planning horizons, which are the length of time to contemplate the economic impacts of a bull selection decision, and then also summarize these results over several different breeding systems, so crossbreeding systems. But in a nutshell, here's what he found. This is a heat map. The W's and C's represent an index where either weaning weight W or carcass C was the endpoint of the calf. And the numbers behind the W's and C's represent the length of the planning horizon from 2 years all the way up to 50 years. And the area I have circled here contrasts weaning endpoint to a carcass endpoint. And the rank correlation amongst a large group of bulls for those two indexes was above 0.7. So conventional wisdom would say, well, high degree of correlation between whether or not I use an index that assumes I sell at weaning or I use an index that assumes I retain ownership. But I would argue that simply a rank correlation doesn't tell the full story, because Hunter compared 27,000 bulls for those two indexes. And if I'm going to a sale, I don't intend to come home with 27,000 bulls in the trailer, right? I'm picking a subset. And so the real question is, how different are the decisions that I'm actually going to make? So what he did here, this is PH's planning horizon, again, from 2 to 50 years. And what is the commonality in the bulls I would actually select among a weaning weight endpoint index versus a carcass index? If I'm just selecting among the top 0.5% of bulls, the top 1%, or the top 5%. You can interpret these numbers I have in the table as really the proportion or the percentage in common amongst those lists. And you can see that the selection decisions I would actually make, the bulls I would actually purchase, are different, right? Now, it increases in commonality as the length of the planning horizon increases. That's because traits that are expressed later in life, like sustained cow fertility or stayability, mature cow weight, increase in importance as the planning horizon increases. And the proportion in common increases as we select a bigger set of bulls. Still, though, there is going to be different decisions made whether I use an index that assumes I sell at weaning or I retain ownership. So I want to dig a bit deeper. And the remaining questions in my mind was, what is the opportunity cost of using an index that does not specifically match my breeding objective? And what are the alternatives to contemplate post-weaning merit when animals are indeed sold at weaning? So I ran through a bunch of scenarios. This was a purebred breeding system with a 20-year planning horizon. I assumed a self-replacing index where animals are actually sold at harvest, one where animals are actually sold at weaning, one when they're sold at weaning and imposed independent culling levels for marbling. Same thing, but this time the independent culling level was imposed for hot carcass weight. And then something that I fear too many producers do, and that's independent culling levels for everything that may be economically relevant for a weaning weight breeding objective. And then did the same thing, but made those independent culling levels even more stringent. So instead of, let's say, assuming everything needed to be above breed average, I assumed they needed to be in the top 25% of the breed. This slide, which I'm not going to go over in the sake of time, but it'll be in the recording, gives specific details about each one of these scenarios. I want to mention a couple of things. For things like mature cow weight, wanted to select animals that were actually favorable, so lighter. For mature weaning weight, tried to select intermediate optimums. And when I imposed independent culling levels for breed average, there were actually more bulls that passed that than what I actually needed. So in this simulation, what I did was said, well, I'm going to select them at random, and here's my dry humor for the day. I rationalized that that was akin to people going out and phenotypically selecting among a large group of bulls. So circling back to the impact weaning weight has, whether I sell at weaning or I retain ownership through the feed yard, this pie chart on the upper left depicts the relative emphasis. So in proportionality, how important is weaning weight to the breeding objective? If I sell in the beef, it's about 2% here. And the marginal economic value associated with it's actually negative. If I sell calves at weaning, then weaning weight directs about 30% of the breeding objective, and of course the marginal economic value is positive. Why would it be negative if I retain ownership? It's really related to where I want to emphasize gain. I don't want to emphasize gain pre-weaning. I want to emphasize gain post-weaning. Specifically, I want to emphasize gain in the feed yard. So I think these two pie charts showing, again, relative emphasis help depict one of the primary differences in the indexes and the breeding objectives, depending on the endpoint you sell your calves. To the scenarios I talked about before, what this shows are the bulls in common amongst the top 0.5% of selection candidates between different selection schemes. So carcass here is the carcass index. We have an independent culling level for all maternal traits set at better than the top 25% of the breed. Carcass index versus independent culling levels at breed average. Carcass index versus a weaning index, where I also employed an independent culling level for hot carcass weight. The same thing, but now the independent culling level is for marbling. Then the carcass index compared to a weaning weight index. A weaning weight index compared to a weaning weight index where I imposed an independent culling level for hot carcass weight. And then the last one, similar, but the independent culling level is on marbling score. What I want you to take home from this is really two things. The decisions or selection decisions I would take if I use an economic index, regardless of the breeding objective, are a lot different than if all I do is use independent culling levels. The other thing is the selection decisions I take if I use a carcass index versus I use a weaning weight index are also different. More importantly, though, what's the opportunity cost of that decision? So what I did is I ranked the top 100 bulls, and I got their average economic index value for the weaning weight index, and that was $184. Then I ranked the top 100 bulls based on these other selection criterion, and I got their average weaning weight index value. So the way to interpret this is the top 100 bulls ranked on their carcass index had an average weaning weight index of about $172. That says if I sell at weaning, but I use a carcass index, the opportunity cost of that decision is the difference between 172 and 184, or about $12 in exposure, right? That's the opportunity cost for using an index in this situation that was not optimized for my breeding objective. I want to compare that to using ICL, independent culling levels, based on bulls just had to be breed average for all the traits that were economically relevant if I retain ownership and sell calves at weaning. There, I'm giving up about $40 in exposure. compared to an index that is actually economically optimized for that breeding objective. So huge loss in profit potential. If I use these weaning weight indexes, rank bulls based on that, and then after that impose an independent culling level, I do give up some. So when I do that for marbling score, it's about $183. For hot carcass weight, about $180. So I'm giving up a little bit compared to just sorting them off the weaning weight index by itself, but not substantial. Dare wanted me to try to hit this quickly. All of this is conditional on an enterprise's unique situation, part of that driven by what their current herd performance is. These two pie charts depict the relative emphasis of something like calving ease, when on the left-hand side, I have no death loss due to dystocia now, and the right side where I'm losing 2% of my calves due to dystocia. And you can see the change in relative emphasis for a trait like calving ease goes from 0 to 10%. And then showing mature cow weight, this is for kind of like an all-purpose type index. I just isolated 3 traits, mature cow weight, stayability, and hot carcass weight, and showed how the relative emphasis of those change as on the horizontal axis, annual cow cost or variable cow cost changes from $250 to $500 to $750 a year. And I know $250 is a ridiculous number, but I wanted to try to show some symmetry here. And the point is, if revenue stays the same and cow cost keeps creeping up, then all of a sudden at the end here, 22.5% of the relative emphasis in my breeding objective is placed on reducing mature cow weight. And these last 2 slides to I know a question near and dear to Dare's heart is are producers actually putting emphasis where they should if their primary motivating factor was profit? And I suspect in a lot of cases the answer to that is no. So some concluding thoughts quickly. My point's not to dissuade anyone from using indexes that are on offer by breed associations now, because clearly using only independent culling levels is suboptimal, and we've known that for a very long time. Go ahead and use the carcass or harvest endpoint index if the value difference, as I showed in my example, can be captured by premiums for your calves. I'd also say that illustrations from tools like iGenDeck can certainly aid in communication to producers, just to show them, relatively speaking, where should you be placing more or less emphasis. And I'd say that the scenarios herein aren't exhaustive, right? There's a lot of different variations I could do, but I think they're enough to kickstart a conversation about who should economic indexes be optimized for. Are there differences in the decisions taken if I sell at weaning or I retain ownership through the feed yard? And if there are differences, is it fair then to assume the cow-calf producer who sells at weaning should be subsidizing the value that is only received later on in the production chain? And so with that, I'd like to thank some people that posed some of these questions initially, and be happy to take any quick questions, Bob.
Great, thanks, Matt. Really interesting. Let's go right here to the Q&A. I've got one, but actually kind of connects both yours and Dr. Lalman's talk, so I'll hold it for just a little bit. Yeah, if you've got a question for Matt, go ahead and post that up. And while we wait a second for that to come, I'll throw a question at you. I think part of the message here, Matt, if I got it right, is that using an index, even if it's not the exact right one's better than lots of other alternatives. Would a reasonable strategy be, many breeds publish a kind of a weaning and an all-purpose kind of index, actually go and sort cattle, primarily based on one, and then apply for lack of a better word, an independent culling level on the other index in that strategy. So, a sort of a TI API approach, but if you had a weaning or maternal index that was to a weaning weight endpoint, use it as a primary sort, and then go down and find the bulls that rank best on the API one that's going to capture, or, TI, if you're, focusing on fed cattle going into a grid system, use that kind of approach.
Yeah, I understand the point and the temptation to do that. My concern is there's a lot of overlap in the traits between those two indexes. So in the example you mentioned, an API and TI, they have all the same traits with the exception of those germane to retaining replacement heifers. And so there's a whole lot of double counting. I'm only okay with imposing an independent culling level when it's on a trait that is not in the index already. Because then there's not this implicit double counting that goes on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good. And sort of to that end, and this will bridge, I think, maybe even a couple of other questions here. As we think about the economic signals in our business today, from the fed cattle and carcass side, are really to make, really big, fast growing, high carcass value cattle. And, that's a little bit contrasted to the discussion we hear from producers relative to cow adaptation to the production environment and the focus of, the system, and knowing that, stocking rate is one of the primary drivers of ranch level profitability for the cow calf sector. How do we use index in the breeding objectives then to sort of help? How do we balance those?
I guess I'll kick off, and I'm keen to hear other thoughts, but I think it backs up to choice of breeding system, Bob. I think we have the temptation to try to make replacement females from the exact same kinds of matings that we try to make terminal animals, and that need not be the case. I can have females that were bred to be quote unquote maternal, and use a terminal breed of sire then to produce those kind of cattle you mentioned, and kind of have my cake and eat it too. And we don't leverage those kinds of things in our industry the way we should.
Yeah. So the separation of the maternal terminal mating decision. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Let's dive in, Dr. Lalman, if you're still there. A couple of interesting questions here. One from Philip Lancaster here, and it says the relationship between maintenance energy, or MEM, and milk is interesting. So maintenance energy for maintenance, or metabolizable energy for getting all my M's mixed up here, Dave. MEM and milk is interesting. This is a phenotypic relationship. So the cows with low MEM eat more above maintenance, and so they produce more. Do you think this is the same for the genetic relationship, which is the cause and the effect? So kind of the dilution of maintenance idea, really, right? So it's the surplus energy that's left in the system to do other stuff with.
It's a good question. Let me characterize that data set just a little bit more. It might help clarify, help answer his question. Probably won't get all the way there, but in that study, we very tightly controlled feed intake. The cows did not get to select, or did not get to eat all they wanted. And the way we controlled feed intake was we measured the cow's body weight every week. Now, they were lactating and we were milking them frequently. So we, of course, we knew the energy that was being partitioned to milk production. But we'd weigh them every week. And if a cow gained a little bit of weight, we dropped the amount of feed they were provided over the next week. If they lost a little bit of weight, we bumped the feed intake for that following week. And so by the end of the winter, and this study went on, as I recall, for an average of about 110 days over 2 different years, 110 days each year. By the end of that period, we knew pretty well how much energy was required to keep that cow from gaining or losing weight. In other words, changing body composition. And so, we tried to basically take out the effect of differences in feed intake to study, the influence of that productivity at maintenance, meaning at body tissue maintenance, on their maintenance requirements.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And, I think a good example now of, you use some precision technology to manage that intake on cows. And so you could tightly control that where, a decade ago, we couldn't do that same sort of thing in individual cow feeding situations very conveniently or very precisely. So
it would be nice to have had that equipment, Bob, but we didn't have ours yet. So
oh, really? So you did it the old-fashioned hard way then?
technical equipment was a good crew of grad students in those used round red feed tubs.
Excellent.
But we weighed the amount of feed they got every day.
Graduate students a pretty high-tech approach as well, right? So
most definitely.
yeah. Great. Well, good work there. Another question here from Mark. I think this one's for Matt. Says, I liked your comment that the cow-calf producer emphasizing weaning weight is subsidizing the feeder. With that said, what percentage of bulls sold in the U.S. Do you think are really terminal bulls, but purchased for making replacement females?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. My choice of subsidizing was probably a strong word because I'm sure there's plenty of cattle feeders that would say, well, let me show you a bunch of cattle that I bought that clearly had no plan in place when the breeding decisions were made, right? But I don't know what I'm not even going to venture a guess of the fraction of bulls, but I would say it's safe that the overwhelming majority of cow-calf producers try to do two things. That's create replacement females and terminal offspring, where those terminal offspring are sold at weaning or ownership is retained. So they're trying to do two things, and they're using the same bulls to do both. I would also say that I think it's fair that the lion's share of people relinquish ownership of calves at weaning, and are encouraged to put emphasis on post-weaning traits because that should drive value for their calves, even though they're not directly economically incentivized to do so.
Yeah, great. One last question here, and as I read it, there may be a spot for both of you to comment on this one, and it's from David Sechrist at Utah. But says, following up on Bob's question, I agree that a terminal breeding can allow a producer to have their cake and eat it too. However, many producers are limited in their ability due to size or extensive nature of operation to have a separate terminal herd. In that case, how do you balance maternal environmental fitness with the growth and carcass characteristics valued post-weaning?
So a quick thought on that. I understand not everybody has the size and scale to have two separate herds with two separate objectives. I also don't think that every commercial producer needs to generate their own replacements. Those replacements can be purchased. Now, I understand it's a bit of a chicken or egg question, right? So who's going to do that? That's going to create demand for other producers to make replacement females as a key part of their operation. But it's not written in stone that people have to make their own replacements. Those can be purchased. Mark Thalman's given good, I think, really good talks centered on this, that ideally those purchased females would be coming with their second or third calf already, be crossbred, obviously, and created with maternal traits in mind.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Matt. I think two really important points there is one, you don't have to be engaged in both pieces of that maternal terminal thing to be a producer, right? So abandon the replacement side and go purchase those, and you don't have to buy them as heifers, right? There's no law that says my replacements all got to be weaned heifer calves. I got to spend 2 years nurturing along to get them into the productive cow herd. Go find something that makes money right off the bat. Yeah, good perspective. Matt, David, thanks so much, both of you, for your time today and energy in creating your talks. Really have appreciated your perspectives. We're going to stop for today. Encourage you to join us next week for session 3 of our eBEEF brown bagger. We'll focus on understanding methane from phenotyping to selection opportunities, joined with 2 outstanding young scientists that are engaged in our animal breeding and genetics community. First off will be Dr. Bailey Engel. Bailey's at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. And we'll talk of tools of a new trade, methane phenotyping for genetic evaluation. So actually, collecting that methane emission data on beef animals, and then followed by Dr. Troy Rowan at the University of Tennessee on selecting for methane emissions, global examples and opportunities in the U.S. beef industry. So giving us some context of other activities around the planet and their attack and approach to selecting against methane emission. So look forward to those 2 talks. Dare Bullock's hosting next week, so Dare, be ready. But really appreciate everybody joining this week and sticking with us here just a little bit past 1. And again, look forward to seeing you noon Wednesday, October 16th for round 3. Thanks so much.